This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, PreSonus, API Audio, Isotope, Sound Porter Mastering, JZ Microphones, and Spectra 1964. And you're hearing my voice right now on the JZ BB29 microphone through the Spectra 1964 STX100 mic pre, C610 comp limiter, and Isotope RX and Ozone. So get ready to rock.
With Ableton, I'll have a little MIDI note on every kick drum as a trigger. And I use that trigger to guide all the sidechain plugins and all the tracks so it knows this is where timing is. Because it can get very confusing. The more plugins you stack on things, the more problems you have with delay compensation, which will change the whole timing and the whole rhythm of your groove. So it sounds really like overly detailed, but it's a crucial part of my session setups.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. I've got two words for you that will help you make your best record ever and not lose it. Storage and backup. You want fast drives for composing and recording and reliable drives for backup so you don't lose all your hard work when something goes wrong. That's why I chose OWC Mercury Extreme Pro 6G internal SSDs for my studio computer and Mercury Elite Pro external drives for archiving. Discover the best OWC drive options for your studio at macsales.com/rockstars. The Spectra 1964 STX100 mic pre provides unequaled headroom and linear output regardless of transient audio peaks, capturing critical details from your microphone. The 100 series amplifiers were used by Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, and the Record Plant on records by ZZ Top, Aerosmith, and John Lennon. Now you can get that same incredible sound in your studio at spectra1964.com or call them at 801-797-0642. Studio One from PreSonus is the ideal DAW for your home studio, taking you from songwriting all the way through mixing and mastering with a full suite of virtual instruments, guitar amps, and plugins for creative inspiration. It's easy to use for the beginner, yet fully customizable for your high-speed workflow as you become an expert. Get started now with Studio One Artist and PreSonus Sphere for access to all software learning and creative collaboration at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Morgan Page, a Grammy-nominated producer and DJ with hundreds of millions of plays and charted multiple Billboard, Beatport, and US dance radio #1s. Morgan has built a massive live following performing at major festivals across the world, including Coachella, EDC, Electric Zoo, Burning Man, and Ultra Music Festival, as well as countless shows in the world's top venues and clubs. He typically tours nearly year-round and holds a Las Vegas residency at Daylight, having previously held a 3-year residency at Wynn Las Vegas. Of course, we're doing this interview in the time of quarantine, so times have changed, but hopefully that will come back again soon. Morgan also curates and hosts a weekly radio mix show, In the Air, which airs on Sirius XM and broadcasts weekly, uninterrupted for nearly 10 years and has surpassed episode number 500. Congrats on that. I'm getting close to 300 here. Outside of music, his two main passions are the environment and technology, and particularly where the two intersect. The Tesla driving producer, that's you, Morgan, installed solar panels to power his recording studio. That's very cool. He is always on the cutting edge and an early adopter and advocate of new tech. In 2013, he brought to life the groundbreaking Morgan Page Presents 3D Tour, a forward-thinking immersive visual experience utilizing 3D technology. And in 2014, partnering with Oculus DTS and Alienware, he also produced the first ever virtual reality lyric video for his single In the Air, followed by an Oculus partnership to produce a Gear VR mobile experience for his single Open Heart. Most recently, he's produced music for Tesla and SpaceX. Morgan's Quick Tips project is his way to pass on his vast wealth of knowledge and experience to an eager audience of musicians and producers, as well as the broader creator community, helping them crack the creativity code and improve their workflow. MPQT, as it's called in short, is comprised of a series of 750 plus short form tips and 50 or more blog posts, deep dives, available online and in physical card sets. Recently, Morgan partnered up with the technology leader OWC, also a sponsor on this podcast, to distribute the cards and connect with creators as a brand ambassador. So very cool stuff. Also, shout out to OWC for making our introduction. Please welcome Morgan Page to Recording Studio Rockstars. Morgan, are you ready to rock, my friend?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Dude, glad to have you here, man. I met you at, I believe it was at Winter NAMM at the OWC booth when you handed me this incredible pack of cards, which I have in front of me. Tell us about these cards. These are just gorgeous. I mean, like, I can't get over the graphics. They're so cool looking.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a long time in the works. You know, I started doing these tips on Twitter, and then a friend of mine who was working at Pioneer at the time was saying, why don't you get these out to people, and why don't you start doing them on Twitter using short form? I mean, Twitter was all about having, 24 characters. So I wanted to figure out a way to get these more complex ideas reduced down to little bite-sized nuggets. So I was kind of compiling them on my own, decided to just keep at it and build this spreadsheet of the tips. And then I eventually whittled them down to figure out what are the best 64 tips. And then from the 64, I started talking to different companies about publishing versions of it. And OWC and I talked about doing something together, and we did 20 of the cards. So 20 of the best, most effective, most universal tips.
Yeah.
And the whole purpose really with the tips was selfishly just so I didn't forget what was working in the studio and on the road, because it's philosophical tips. There's some shortcuts, there's heuristics, there's workflow, there's engineering tips. It covers a lot of stuff from the whole process. It's not just how to get a fat kick drum. So right. I forget, progress is very much a zigzag, and I wanted to find a way to, kind of have a checklist in my mind of things to do, things not to do, and be able to keep track of it, not forget it. So selfishly, I just wanted to have a resource. So I just built this knowledge base, and it started resonating, building a nice little vocal community. It's been a fun little side project. So just documenting this stuff. And then now it really is a way to, I think, empower creators so that they can make a sustainable living from music and maybe suffer a little less in the process of creativity and just enjoy the art more.
Well, now I'm lucky enough to be holding the cards in my hand, so I'll describe them a little bit. Rockstars, here's one, and it's just got these beautiful colored lines that are kind of interweaving. And if I move it to my right a little bit, I realize it looks a lot like my patch bay, and it's just called color coding. So, for example, what would that one be? Not to put you on the spot to remember all your quick tips right off the top of your head, but I'm guessing you might know that one.
This one's funny because a lot of them they're easy to forget that the basics are sometimes the most important things. So a lot of people have not done this in their studio. The trick that I like to do is color coding everything. So maybe even color code your wall warts and your power adapters, because quickly in the studio, if you have a hardware-based studio or if you have a hybrid of software and hardware, you just have spaghetti. You have a mess of cables everywhere. So you really have got to label them all, write what they are, both ends of the cable, and then color code them and kind of create a legend in your mind of maybe all the power cables are going to be blue and maybe all the audio cables are going to be red. It can be, you just have to create your own system that works for you. But if you take care of the plumbing ahead of time using these tips, you can be more creative later on. So the creative flow works better. So color code everything. Sounds simple. It just takes a little more effort to implement it, but it can be a total game changer in the studio.
Yeah, I could probably take your plumbing analogy to a pretty bad joke, but it's like get your plumbing right before you need to, before you really need it. But it's funny because I remember when I was interning at Woodland Studios here in East Nashville, Daniel Lanois, the producer who produced U2 and many other bands, came in and he was doing all these clever things, like they were numbering cables and stuff like that and giving things names. And I can't remember if they color coded, but it's the same idea. It's this simplifying this stuff so that we're not like having to go into tech brain when we're just trying to be creative. And then we did some of the color coding once at my Bonnaroo studio, which was a live studio, and we had to work really quickly. And, I guess a question to you is, are there limits to that? Because sometimes we found ourselves trying to do double and triple colored tape on things, and before we know it, it was almost like we made it too complicated again.
Yeah, you can go down the rabbit hole pretty quickly, and you could use washi tape, which is patterns, and maybe that assigns more novelty to it. That's the whole purpose, though, is really just like using mnemonics or other devices to remember things. So, let's say you have a dozen hard drives. Maybe you assign them names from the Marvel universe or something. It sounds cheesy, but
nice.
If you assign novelty, or maybe they just have different color names or different astrological signs. If you take a naming series and apply them, it's going to give them a lot more novelty than Samsung Drive 5 or OWC Drive 6, and that just those little steps, that little bit of housekeeping can make a big difference. So to keep it simple, I would say just like with file folders, don't go too deep. I keep file folders a depth of three folders max if I can.
Nice.
So with colors, maybe just stick to primary colors or to colors that you just have easy access to, and you can. But you've got to be able to have a system that you can sustain. That's the key thing.
Yeah. So that actually, you remind me of something that I haven't done in years, but like way back in OS 9, or even earlier, like 7, I think. We used to there was a trick where you could take the icons for the hard drives, and you could probably still do it now, and you can swap them out. So you could go take a little transformer icon and swap out your hard drive icon with that so that it shows up on your desktop looking like the thing you're giving a name for. So that's a great tip.
Yeah, you can still do it, definitely. I need to do that more often.
Exactly, we all do, don't we?
Digitally, as with a lot of things, the digital version of color coding is much easier, just like using tags in, Mac OS. But when you get into the hardware realm, it gets trickier, because what I found was I kept changing my studio setup as new gear would come in. I'd buy stuff, I'd sell stuff, things would break, I'd move stuff into storage, and then all your labeling that you had a label writer for becomes redundant. So that system's got to be really flexible. So it's almost like working with templates. You've got to have something that's not too rigid, but is open form enough to go with you on your journey in the studio.
Yeah, that's a good tip. So it's like, as you develop your system, don't worry right now, today, about it being perfect for 10 years. Just know that it needs to work this year or next year, maybe, and it can evolve.
Yeah, let it evolve. Like, I've never wanted to use those permanent cable ties. I always use Velcro ties in the studio. And I can't do stuff that's permanent, because I know the setup is going to keep changing, and you buy a new converter and then that whole system has to be redone. So, but yeah, I think one of the easiest ways to do it, just to simplify it, is I use Mogami cables in the studio, and they're very hard to see the numbers on them, even the snakes in the D sub cables they have.
Yeah.
So I write my own numbers with metallic ink on them, so I can see them in the dark much better. Or if the light hits it, I can see it. But otherwise, you're squinting to see what number's what, and if you're more right brain focused, that stuff will really derail your flow, and it just gets frustrating for something as simple as hooking up send and returns.
Yeah, I'm going to circle back to that in just one sec too. But you mentioned something about a folder being 3 levels deep, and I think you had sort of a rule of 3 touches or something that was one of your quick tips. Is that?
Yeah.
Am I remembering that correctly? And is that related?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So what you want to elaborate on the rule of 3 touches?
Rule of 3 touches, just if you create too much of a depth to your folder hierarchy, you start to get lost. I mean, I think we all felt that pain when we're trying to find the presets for plugins that are, every manufacturer stores them in a different place on your hard drive for some bizarre reason.
Mm-hmm.
Like literally, like there's like 9 places you can have to go digging to find your presets, and sometimes you don't know where they are in your library on your Mac. Maybe it's easier on PC. So I think if you create a shallower depth to the way you structure things, you can get to them faster. And that originated with, that was a Steve Jobs rule. That's how he liked to think of things. It's just like the rule of three with, movies and things and structure. It's a structural rule.
Yeah, it's how many sizes of drink you can order at McDonald's.
Right.
There's a good reason for it.
Yeah.
So that is, it's great. It's great to hear you bring up these topics like that, because I've brought that up on the podcast a number of times when I talk to somebody who really is comfortable in the world of programming music. I like to ask the dumb questions like, how do you organize this stuff? How do you know where to find it? And so it's good to be reminded that you need to be proactive with it. So when you're installing software, do you almost never just let it do the default installation? Are you always sort of guiding software to go to the places you want it to go?
I let it do the default because I learned the lesson of, I would prefer it not to do the default method, but a lot of the software, if you try to over customize it, the plugins or the presets that come with it, the factory presets, will just disappear and you have to relocate them, reinstall them. So I let it do a default first, and then later on I can do a custom install. But that's I think that's something more software companies need to work on, is cloud sync for presets, and just having a way that it's you have more direct access to it. It's not just somewhere else on the hard drive.
Okay, there was another tip that you had in there called, I think it was called first order retrievability. And it just made me think about, availability of physical tools too in your workspace. Do you want to talk about that concept? Am I asking the same question about the rule of threes, or is this
no
different?
No, this one, and this one is more about spatialness, spatial recall. So it's sort of like if with like a pegboard, a lot of people will trace their tools, an outline of their tools, like it's the most common thing. Yeah. But I love it. Like it's so common. It's not a secret, but you trace the outline of a tool so that you can easily put it back in its place.
Yeah, but trace it in pencil, right? So you can erase it and change everything next year.
You could do pencil. You could do a China marker, like a wax marker. Little things like that, just to get things back quickly and stay organized. Otherwise, it'd just be a mess of things. Just to be able to get to the tools quickly. So, I think the pegboard is the best example of that. And also having vertical organization beyond the pegboard. So maybe you have, I saw a guy, actually Vance Powell had this setup where he has guitar pedals with hook and loop Velcro on the back, and he has the pedals vertical. So there's a Velcro wall, and he can reorder his guitar pedals and stick them on with Velcro. And they're not on the floor getting dust and things. Like we assume that everything's got to be on the floor with guitar pedals, which is pretty funny. It makes sense, but you don't always have to play guitar through guitar pedals. So his idea was just great though. Like have it so you can reorder, and you have this modular system, and it's vertical. So it's at your eye level. It's
an entire wall of coolness to your left in his control room. It's pretty wild. It's every fun piece of gear you could ever imagine. Do you want to know how I get a consistent sound quality mixing hundreds of episodes of Recording Studio Rockstars? Well, I've been cheating all along by using Isotope RX and Ozone on every single episode. Right now, you are hearing RX declick, declip, DS, deplosive, voice denoise, Ozone multiband compression, EQ, and limiting on my voice. If you want great consistent mixes too, go to isotope.com/rockstars and use the code ROCK10 to get an additional 10% off. Have you ever struggled to finish a mix wondering if it was truly ready for mastering? Wouldn't it be great to have a trusted coach walk you through the final stages of mixing so that you could confidently deliver your mix for professional mastering, knowing that it was just right? At soundporter.com, home of the iterative mastering process, Brian Murphy is your trusted coach to listen to your needs and help you get your mix ready for mastering. Contact Brian now for a free mix review and mastering demo at soundporter.com. Well, so you mentioned also something about labeling things with the, I think it was a paint pen or something, so you could see it in the dark. And it occurred to me to ask you, about what that means to you. So for those of us in the studio, we're probably used to oh, I got to look behind the rack and see something in the dark, and that sucks. And, then I learned to buy lots of those, climbing headlamps and stuff like that.
Still the best.
And then the iPhone comes along, and now that's, everybody's got an iPhone in their pocket. But you're talking about also probably your live rig, because when you're out there doing the live thing, you're constantly having to fish around in the dark and deal with organization, right?
Yeah, and you never know what setup a club or a festival is going to have. I mean, thankfully now my setup's pretty streamlined with USBs, but when I would bring my computer in, laptop, if you didn't have your power cables labeled properly, you could unplug somebody else's setup by accident. You've got somebody, you don't have the luxury of a changeover sometimes, and you've got to be able to get into the booth with somebody slamming the monitors and not unplug their setup and lose all the momentum of the crowd.
Right, because you're picking up right where another DJ left off without even stopping the music?
Right, they'll just do like an effect out, and then you jump in with your intro and pray everything's working.
Oh, and that's fascinating.
And if it's not working, at Coachella, you get 45 minutes. And I had a computer issue once at Coachella, and I lost 10 minutes of my set just rebooting in the Sahara tent. So it's like, you've got to be ready. And those things will only happen at the most critical events. It's just Murphy's Law.
Now, you've been doing this for a while. Did you start out actually taking, like your physical Roland SH-101 out and setting it up with cables running in and out of it? Or has most of live performance been, computer-based and playing stuff that's been recorded or is generated within the computer?
First tour I did, I actually lugged an MPC 2000 and an EMU E6400 and a Nord lead. Like I brought it all as a live PA, which was just insane. And it wasn't cool to do then. It's kind of like a little more of a novelty now, but the sound is amazing, but it's crazy because you're not even running through any mastering or compression. It was just raw sound. And it sounded pretty amazing on those systems. So that first live show I ever did was with an MPC, and I didn't even recognize my own kick drum.
Oh, you mean because it just didn't sound like what you're used to when you were heard it up on the stage? Yeah,
I hear it on a big system in a nightclub in an Irish pub in Boston. It was like your music just transforms on a big system.
Yeah, so I'm glad you went there because you knew I was going to go there. And I'm not a DJ, but I'm fascinated by it, and I'm like I like to think of myself as a closet, EDM producer, a wannabe. But that's one of the common themes I hear though is especially if we're going to talk about like how do you get the low end right in a mix and stuff like that. What do we need to know about the difference between what we think is right in our control room when we're trying to have low end and bass versus what's actually will be expected when it goes out to a club?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that there is a lot of trial and error, and you've got to go and test. You got to work with samples that work. And the studio environment sounds so different than the club environment, no matter what anybody says. Your monitors are never flat. That's a total myth. And if they're super flat, they're also not really very fun to work with. So,
but the club's not really flat either, right?
Right. There really is no flat setup. I mean, you're not making clinical music. And in the club, things do need to be loud, and there's a lot of steps you want to take so that the songs work together and blend. But there's so much has to do with the presence of the bass, making sure things aren't phasing each other, and just making sure that you have room. Like if you overdo the bass in that studio environment, those problems are going to be magnified on a club system as it's getting compressed and limited again. So you've got to leave a little room. And I think some of the most effective ways to give it some breathing room are also with the arrangement. So you like letting a little bit of silence before a big drop hits, letting the compressors reset. So you want aggressive mixes, but I think my favorite way of doing it all is a lot of parallel effects and parallel distortion, parallel compression, so that you can get the aggression, but still have all the control and keeping control of bass in the mix. But ultimately, I have to mix, at least with my setup, I use Focal SM9s, which I love. They're a little hyped, but I have to sort of, I have to take the opinion of the speakers with a grain of salt. And sometimes I'll use a thing called the sub pack, which is really useful.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Because your ear just can't hear those low octaves as well. Sometimes you don't hear, sometimes you might even have the wrong bass note in there. I'll look at the MIDI on sessions and be like, wow, that wasn't even the right note, but it was so low that I didn't catch it, as I'm bouncing like remix stems down in the mix.
So the SM9s are pretty big. I just pulled them up. They're big honking. Do they sort of have a built-in sub in each speaker?
Yeah, they've got built-in subs, and they're pretty decent size, like the studio the size of a 2-car garage. So I think you just have to know your room and your system. And I think sometimes it's a fool's quest to try to find this perfectly tuned room. You could spend so much money doing that. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, I like to check it on the monitors, check it on V-Moda M100s. That's what I use. They hype the sound as well, but I know that sound so well. Now I have to use the experience of testing these on the road and hearing it in a variety of clubs. So usually what happens, even after doing this for 20 years, I play the mix out. I think it's where I need it to be. And then I play it live and I go, wow, that was so far off. I have so much more work to do. And that happens every time. I've never been like, oh, nailed it. It's perfect. It just doesn't happen like that. But
you still pump your fist in the air like it's the greatest thing ever, right?
Right. And hopefully nothing's muted. Like hopefully no critical element is missing from the bounce, or it's cropped wrong.
Yeah.
But you just have to get out there. You have to build that volume of work and play it live and see how it works in your set relative, because you're not just playing music in a vacuum. You're playing music between other songs. So I'm testing in new material, doing a test master between finished masters that are proven club hits. So I've got they've got to stand up, and that can be frustrating sometimes, for sure.
So all right, when you bring up mastering, I wanted to ask you that. I mean, is mastering part of the process of making EDM? Do you work with a mastering engineer like you might on a traditional studio record? Or is that just something that you learn to do as part of your production? It sounds like you're saying you do it yourself, because when you're at the club, you hear 2 proven tracks, yours is in the middle, and if it doesn't hit right, you go back to tweak it some more.
Yeah, I'll do a test master, and then I bounce down all the stems, and I send that to Wired UK. They do stem mastering. And so they'll do a master, and it is tricky though, because sometimes your mix is better, and sometimes the mastering mix is much better, and it's more of a confidence thing of having fresh ears. I'm hiring fresh ears. Mm-hmm. Somebody who can objectively hear it and has done a ton of dance music, because dance music does have to be a little more aggressive. It's not it's not traditional mastering, and it has to have that bite to it and that punch. But there's so many things that I have to get right on my end, just at the mixing stage. Otherwise, what's mastering going to do? They can't polish something that isn't very strong and is missing, the bass or the fundamentals. Sometimes mastering guys will bring in a different kick and they'll swap it out. But I like to go in and really give them enough room to work with the mix. And it also can be a bigger challenge now as the plugins are getting better, like Gullfoss and Soothe, and some pretty complex, powerful plugins now that can be really useful, or they can also be very hard if you put them on the master and then you send it off to get mastered, and it's hard for them to recreate. If you're mixing into these plugins, it can cause more issues. So
you can smooth out all the excitement.
Yeah, it's better to do it at the bus level. I think thinking of everything as stems and treating your stems with parallel compression, distortion, limiting, treating those stems is just so helpful. And it's also just so good for future-proofing your records.
So you got the stems going on, and the stems, sending that to mastering allows the mastering engineer to adjust the balance between kicks and bass and mids and highs and stuff like that to make sure that it's blending properly on the big system that they're. Now, do the mastering places, do they have to have a staff of 50 so they can always have a dance party going on to test the mastering out?
They got to, yeah. No, it's usually just done in a clinical mastering studio somewhere, and it's just a guy, and they are able to work really quickly, get it done in an hour or two. But I also send them notes on the mix on what I have in my master. So I give them the headroom. I take off some of the process. Well, I'm sending them stems, so they're not getting processed. But I have a whole note sheet. I say, what tempo is it? What key is it? What plugins at what settings? Like, I have an SSL on there. I have a fab filter limiter. I have a multi-maximizer, sometimes just lightly compressing it. So I make sure to write all that stuff down, and it's a pain in the butt, but you got to do it.
And that's on your 2 mix?
Right.
Okay, so
just so they can recreate the mix with the stems.
Right. So you've got stems with all the processing, and then you still do something to the two mix, but you try not to be extreme with the two mix, or you try not to paint yourself into a corner.
Right. It's just to demo it, to show them how I was mixing it, because I've mixed into that chain at the end of the record.
Yeah, that's very cool. API Audio has been designing mic pre's, compressors, and EQs for more than 50 years. Every product they make includes founder Saul Walker's original proprietary op amps and transformer designs to make sure you always get that legendary API sound in your studio. Whether you are writing songs for fun or mixing Grammy-winning hits, API has got you covered with individual modules, rack units, and dedicated consoles to make sure your next record is your very best. Go to APIaudio.com. Sometimes you just need a mic that will stand out in a mix. That's when you need the new BB29 Signature Series from Jay-Z Microphones. The unique single diaphragm Golden Drop capsule gives the BB29 airy highs and smooth mid-range to help your tracks stand at the front of your mix. Jay-Z's handcrafted, fully discreet microphones come with a 5-year warranty and free shipping to the US. You're hearing my voice on the BB29 right now. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the BB29 at jzmic.com. All right, let me see what I'm writing down things as fast as I can. All right, so talk to us about your studio. I mean, what you have this in your bio, you talk about having a solar powered studio. That's cool as shit. I've worked with the artist Jack Johnson, who I think also was had a solar powered studio, and I've read about some in Tape Op magazine and stuff. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it sounds more exotic than it is. It's funny because there's all this work to get the studio, to get everything installed. And it's basically just, we put a solar panel on the roof of my house. I live where I work, and it doesn't power everything. So, I mean, it can power the entire studio, no problem. But charging electric cars needs a lot of juice.
Right.
So those take up a lot, but it's like in the middle of the day, everything is flying completely on solar power. And it's cool to be able to drive on solar power is amazing as well. So the only thing missing are power walls, the Tesla power walls. So I got to get some of those.
What are the Tesla power walls?
They are able to, basically it's like having a giant UPS, and you could have like a battery backup, or it's similar to having a generator. So if you make too much power with your panels with solar energy, it'll store that. And then you can use that energy instead of pulling from the grid when the power is cheaper.
And it just goes in the walls or something?
Yeah, it just mounts against one of the walls. They're not cheap, but they also are great. Even if you didn't have the solar panels, it would store the power from the grid, so you'd have a day or two of emergency power.
That's cool. And you're out in LA, so now does Elon Musk actually like physically come over and install this stuff for you?
He doesn't. I've played a couple gigs for him, and it's funny because I've gotten to know the Musks through separate projects for Tesla and SpaceX. He hasn't done the personal install, but
that's really cool. Though I've really enjoyed listening to him talk online and stuff. He's such a great character, and doing amazing things.
Yeah.
Well, cool. All right. So solar powered studio. What might somebody expect to hear as a difference by having a solar powered studio? Is there anything sonically that gets improved?
I was wondering that, just jokingly, like, does that, because I did call one of my albums DC to Light, even though it's really
nice.
light to DC. You'd wonder, because I do have things hooked up to this, what is it, a PS Audio reconditioner, because the power in LA is so bad. There's so many little spikes and sags in the power.
Mm-hmm.
I'm up especially in the hills, as the power lines weave up the hills. I actually fried speakers. I had some Barefoots a long time ago, and they got fried from all the power fluctuations. So that's a really important tip for your studio. Something you never think about is keeping that voltage at a steady 120 or 122.
Yeah.
Not the sexiest thing in the world, and power regenerators are a little expensive, but I just I don't know if I believe the hi-fi audio stuff, but power is super important for everything, just to keep the gear alive, if not sounding amazing.
Yeah. And also, I think one of the challenges when you think about that is if it sounds incredibly pure and perfect for me in my studio, is it even going to sound like that at the club that I'm trying to make sure I get the bass right for?
Right. It's just like playback on converters. Like you could buy the most amazing antelope audio converters and clock things and really go down that rabbit hole of diminishing returns. But like what matters at the end of the day when the crowd is hearing that music and it's hitting them in the chest? Like what matters?
Yeah. So now if we're recording things with microphones, we may feel like as long as our capture conversion is really high resolution, then we're getting it into the computer sounding great. How often are you recording, actual analog sources as part of your process, or is everything sort of created from within the computer?
It's less and less because I do have a analog chain that I use for tracking vocals that I've been building since college. I have a Avalon 737, Purple Audio, MC77, LA2A. That's my go-to chain, pretty standard chain, and with a Manley mic. But I started out everything with a cheap studio project C1. So I did my first song, The Longest Road, with, and it's funny, like I used to track everything in my bedroom studio. I'd flip up the mattress and that would be the isolation booth.
Nice.
And we got really good results just with good talent, good singers, lots of layering, a little bit of auto-tune, just a touch of auto-tune. And so now I get more sessions from engineers that are, remote sessions where I get a top line in and it's already been recorded pretty high quality. Mm-hmm. And I may ask them to go back and do some other passes, but I really do like the result of having people in studio. And I want to do more sessions back like I used to, where there's no vocal booth, but the singer's singing right behind me. And I track it to that chain. I ride it manually, process the hell out of it. And sometimes the flaws even help it,
Now, when you say ride it manually, what are you referring to?
Just the preamp, just when the vocalist is getting super loud, either a combination of the preamp and the output.
Yeah, because you have real singers for a lot of stuff you do.
And if they're belting it out, it's the worst if they clip it too hard. It is nice these days with 32-bit recording that you can pull it down and recover those peaks. They're not chopped off. That's really nice.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
Yeah.
I quite honestly, I read about that and I hear about that with sound devices, for example, but I haven't actually done that myself. So I haven't actually recorded something too hot at 32 and then pulled it down. What, if you were going to explain exactly what that would be like for somebody who's listening and hasn't experienced that?
Yeah.
How does that happen?
It's funny because it's something that I didn't even know was possible. I had heard benefits to 32-bit, and I often forget about this, but it's a really important thing that's buried in Ableton and other DAWs. I don't know how the other DAWs do it, but at least if I have a clip of audio, I just pull the trim down. If it looks like something is getting totally squashed, I bring the trim down and then I can see visually the waveform. I can see the peak, the top peak dropping and everything relative to that. So you can recover.
And that's the clip itself?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So what is your DAW? Are you in Ableton Live primarily?
Yeah, all Ableton. I did for years. I used Pro Tools and didn't feel that the MIDI was strong enough. There was stuff like MIDI would fall off the grid. They still didn't fix some really crucial things because the bread and butter is a lot of post-production and a lot of live recording where it's less about the grid and more about just a raw performance. But I found, but there were things I loved about Pro Tools, like playlists and things, but I'm sure that's coming to Ableton. But Ableton, they prioritize some strange things. Like there's some really interesting, unique features in there that are not so musical, and some that are. Like there's great ways to capture MIDI. If you have an idea, you play it, but you didn't hit record. You can recover that performance. That's really
amazing. Cool. But let's let people know about that. So there's certainly those who are listening who haven't even used Ableton Live, but they're curious. Like you said, Ableton does things like you can perform for half an hour and go, man, I really had a great idea there. Too bad I wasn't in record. And then you can hit record before you hit stop and it actually recorded it all. Is that's kind of how it works, right?
Yeah. And it'll even approximate what the tempo was. Because a lot of times when you hit record, your brain is not relaxed and you hear the metronome and you get nervous and you're not going to get your best take. So
I only get nervous when I'm interviewing you. Right.
There's no metronome.
No metronome. So it recognizes the tempo, and then it kind of, when you hit stop, it says, here you go, here's what you did, or an approximation.
Yeah. And and I always feel that it's better to replay parts than to edit. So that's been my rule. It often takes longer to edit something and just easier to redo the performance if you have that luxury. So, I obviously quantize a lot of things. Electronic music, it's a lot about very tight quantization and side chaining the hell out of everything.
Yeah, so that brings up a couple of points. One is Ableton Live also makes it like everything's automatable. You don't have to tell it, hey, let's automate this one aspect of this plugin. You just put it into record and turn the plugin and it got recorded, right?
Yeah, that's the best part. And just very simple automation lanes. Logic's great too. Logic looks a lot prettier than Ableton, but that was one thing in Pro Tools I didn't like as much. It was a little trickier you had to assign things through menus to hardware controls, and Ableton will just learn it.
Yeah, and it's easier now because you can do the triple bear claw, click on it, and turn on the automation for that feature. But still, Ableton is, hands down best for that. And the other thing that was very cool about Ableton, I remember, is you could grab a plugin and drop it on something, and it doesn't stop the playback.
Yeah,
it just magically makes it delicious.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, cool. So let's see. I had another question, and it was about quantization. Yes. So you mentioned quantization. EDM is typically a lot of very tight quantization. And, on another end of the spectrum, you might have a hip hop production, a Jay Dilla kind of thing. How often, which I think is, more about making it very loose, how often do you have to manipulate the exactness of your quantization with EDM? What is the balance of all that? Are there things that are exactly precisely on the grid, and then other things that sound better if they're not?
Yeah, I think that is really important to have an anchor, so that to be loose, you've got to have some things that are the tent pole propping it up. Well, the kick drum, keep the kick drum exactly on the grid, and then maybe the claps are loose and they're nudged forward. So I'll typically move low end things, I'll delay the bass, and nudge high end things just a little bit. And it is crazy though, that if you just nudge a kick 1 or 2 milliseconds, it can totally change your mix. Like these tiny, tiny micro increments can change the phase relationships and the punch of everything. So it is interesting. It may not be the right, it might be the right kick, but the wrong timing. So I think about mixing and recording as like time is your canvas. So it's like it's all about when are things hitting and are you giving space to it. So let's say there's like a lead guitar and you want to sidechain, you want to create more space. So you'd sidechain the reverb to the dry signal of the guitar so that the reverb jumps up when the guitar finishes playing. And that gives the impression of tons of reverb, but it's just an illusion. So little things like that I love.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of getting into the sidechaining question. I know it's a big question.
Yeah.
And you probably get asked it a lot. But what other things should we be aware of with sidechaining? So, and a first-time introduction to sidechaining would probably be to suggest that you take other elements that are not the kick drum, and when the kick lands, you make those other elements go away and then come back in again between the kick. Does that sound like a good way to describe it?
Yeah, I think you're sort of assigning a priority to certain things so that you're having elements react to the kick. And you don't have to have everything sidechained to the kick, but there's so many different ways you could do it. You could have the whole musical mix reacting just to the kick. You can have the vocals reacting to a guitar. There's so many different ways you could set it up. And there's a cool plugin called Track Spacer that's really useful for more transparent. There's transparent sidechaining, which is kind of opening up the bandwidth and creating this illusion that there's more space than there actually is because things are taking turns. And then there's the more obvious pumping effect, which is more like a ducking style effect. So yeah, I like to think of sidechaining too, like how radio announcers the music will duck when they talk.
Yeah. We probably aren't asking about the transparent because it's transparent and we didn't realize it, right?
Yeah.
But we definitely ask about the stuff that you hear. And you have some really incredible choruses in your playlist, Rockstar's a reminder that I've got a video playlist that you can go listen to Morgan's work right now and hear these great mixes. And it's just like when the chorus lands, you just, the music is just bouncing. It's rushing towards you and bouncing with a kick. And it just makes it really exciting. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask about that is, how often does it make sense that you're actually increasing the bass and the kick in the chorus? Or is there sort of does it make sense to think about this like the bass, the kick and the bass are right up there at the top, and it's a question of how cleverly you bring everything else up around it?
Yeah, and it's really important to prioritize the kick. If you don't have the level of the kick right, if you're mixing everything to something else, it's just not going to work. Like the kick has to be the loudest thing, and you got to get that level, set that level first, and then build around it. Because you may try to throw a plug-in on the mix later on to fix the master, but the problem is something very basic, like just the level of the kick.
During the height of record making, the Spectre 1964 100 series preamp was the perfect choice to build consoles for Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, Stax Studios, Ardent Studios, and New York City Record Plant, bringing you the sound of ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, King Crimson, John Lennon, and many more. The 100 series amplifiers offer extremely stable, high-speed circuit design with unequaled headroom, low noise, and linear output, irrespective of transient audio peaks, giving you cleaner, punchier, dynamic recordings. The Spectre 1964 legacy is carried on today through Bill Cheney and Jim Romney. Now you can get that same incredible sound in your studio with the STX Mic Breeze, BBDI, and comp limiters. Go to Spectre1964.com or call 801-797-0642. You're hearing my voice right now on the JZ BB29 microphone, the Spectre 1964 STX 100, and C610 comp limiter. A gold bar should be kept safe in a vault because it's valuable, but it could be replaced if it was ever lost. One of your songs or recordings, on the other hand, is worth more than gold because it's one of a kind. It's you, and if it was ever lost, it could never be replaced. So wouldn't you feel better knowing your music was safe? This is why I like to have a dedicated system drive, audio work drive, virtual instrument storage drive, cloud storage, and an extra large backup drive in my studio computer. And when I'm finished with the project, I move it onto a dedicated pair of external drives for archiving. Thanks to OWC, I can count on my drives being super fast, reliable, and secure so that I can work quickly and sleep soundly at night knowing my music is safe. I want your music to be safe too. Discover the best options for storage and backup for your studio from OWC at macsales.com/rockstars. Have you ever wished you could remove the click track bleed from a singer's vocal mic, the sound of shuffling feet from a full choir, or clicking noises from the valves of an otherwise brilliant trumpet solo? These are just some of the incredible things I've been able to clean up, edit, or remove from a recording using the magic of iZotope RX. Great for mixing with a collection of plugins for your DAW to manage plosives, clicks, S's, noise, buzz, reverb, breaths, and even guitar fret squeaks with a set it and forget it simplicity that lets you focus on your creativity in the studio while you let iZotope handle the audio challenges. If you've ever wanted to truly feel like a magician in the studio, then iZotope RX is your magic wand. Go to iZotope.com/rockstars in the show notes and use the code ROCK10 to get an additional 10% off your first purchase. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now. My guest today is Morgan Page, joining us from LA, and we are talking about making music that makes you want to dance, among other things. Morgan, you ready to jam into the second half of the show here?
Let's do it.
All right. So, if we are somebody that is maybe new to wanting to produce and compose EDM, what are some tips for how we should start with this? Like, what's a good process to think about as how we can get from an idea to something that might be a finished track?
I think the biggest thing is starting out with a good palette of samples, good sample material. I love Splice. I think they're super useful. And it's very easy to curate bits from different sample packs together. Instead of buying the whole pack, you can get chunks of it. So I can take a snare from this set and a drum loop from this one, and I can cross-pollinate these sounds that way it doesn't sound like I just ripped off in a whole sample pack. So I think with dance music, you've got to start with good drums, and it's nothing without a good kick drum.
Right.
And I like to work with what I call living templates. So I have templates that I don't use any default templates that come with the DAW. I build my own templates over the years, and I've made them much leaner now. So they already have markers for, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, bridge. I have a pop template. I have like for songwriting. I have a just instrumental draft for just instrumental club bangers that has the build, the drop, and then these little things. Even like the last note gets a marker, and then the end gets a marker. So you know where to crop it for the bounce. And then I also put in the key and the tempo as a marker, just for reference.
You might have to break this down a little bit more for us. So this is really fascinating to me. When I think of a template, I think of, the classic mix template where we're importing, processing to mix a rock band. But when you're talking about a template, you're talking about the beginning of a compositional process. And are you saying that it's even got, 4 on the floor MIDI notes for what the kick's gonna be and that sort of thing? Or is this, do you actually have kicks and snares in there and hi-hats and things like that? Or is it more like just a timeline outline of how long sections of the song should be?
Well, it depends how you like to work, but with this, I used to do a really exotic template where I'd have all the soft synths and the processing chains and everything in there. And then that kind of creates instability with some DAWs like Ableton. So right now, I have like a couple kick drums in there. I have like 3 or 4 that I know are in the right key that'll have that impact. So like if it's an F or G, that's great. You don't want any kicks in C. It never works. It's either too high or too low.
That's not I thought we were supposed to call that the people's kick.
Right, the people's kick. And that's great for it's great key for a song, but not for a kick. Yeah. So I'll have a couple of good kicks that I know are a good foundation to start from. And then I'll have everything color coded for each stem and every chunk that I want to work with. So there's kick, there's percussion, there's vocals, there's guitars, noise effects. So it's like 8 stems, 8 buses. And so instead of just having the routings be set up, like that's really important. I also have default starting positions for plugins. So I'm not trying to recreate the same master chain every time. And that's nice with Ableton. It's nice to be able to do racks. Most plugins can combine the chain together, but it's great to have a starting position so you're not starting from scratch the plugin every time, and you have that flexibility.
So you already have some kind of drum machine plugin that's got a good starter kick or a collection of favorite kicks, and that would be part of the template as well?
Yeah. It'll be just samples that'll be on the grid already. I already have the tempo at 128 just as a starting point, and these days it's leaning a little slower than that. So maybe it'll be like 125. And so beyond those typical routings, I also have.
Why is it leaning slower? What's wrong with all of us?
It's just a little mellowing. People
Are we all getting old?
The big room. Yeah. Yeah, it's a quarantine effect.
Right on.
No, and what else do? I do just having these things set up so I don't have to waste any time.
Yeah.
Starting from scratch completely, but you also don't want to paint yourself into a corner. So I use Evernote a lot, and I write down like what in the template is not working for me that I need to work on. So I'll keep a list about the template before I forget. Like, nice. I need to. And an important thing with DAWs like Ableton, that timing is everything. As we talked about earlier, if things are just a little off, it'll change the phase relationships. It'll screw up the side chains. So with Ableton, I'll have a little MIDI note on every kick drum as a trigger. And I use that trigger to guide all the sidechain plugins and all the tracks. So it knows this is where the timing is, because it can get very confusing. The more plugins you stack on things, the more problems you have with delay compensation.
Interesting.
Which will change the whole timing and the whole rhythm of your groove. So it sounds really like overly detailed, but it's a crucial part of my session setups.
Right. So you might have a starting session might already have a kick on the timeline, 4 on the floor on beats 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you've also got a MIDI track next to it with a MIDI note on those beats 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right.
And so rather than use the actual audio kick to control through the side chain other plugins, you just use the MIDI note to control the sidechain input on stuff.
Right.
Okay, very cool. This is already opening up a world of fascination. What about this idea of layering stuff? Sometimes when I would play around with a drum machine, I remember the first times I would ever do that, I'd start with some beat and then add something else. And before you know it, you have this like crazy, like, Rio sounding thing, like a street parade going on. And then I sort of wonder in hindsight, like, do you kind of build up to way too much and then just mute everything and then start reopening it up as part of the production and mix process?
Yeah, because I think what's hard is you can very easily overlayer with loops, especially.
Yeah.
Where you're like, oh, this sounds cool. There's more movement. Like, I like to think of the loop as being the engine room that pushes things along, just like a rhythm guitar is propelling the track. You're hitting those 16th notes or maybe 32nd notes, depends on the song and the tempo. But you can start to fill in every hole, and then there's no groove, there's no pocket, and it's just a mess. So I like to just, instead of just muting tracks, I'll solo different combinations of loops and percussion and be like, what do I really need? Like, what can I get rid of? What am I going to miss? And I try to avoid fear layering. That's what I call it, where I'm like, oh, this is a little better, but it's just different. So you got to really have that intention of working where you're not just thinking, oh, this is different, but you got to be like, this is better. This really improves the piece. This serves the song.
Okay. So it's okay. Like, we have permission to go a little crazy in the initial stage and then just figure out which of that we want to keep.
Yeah, you can be the role of the editor later on. But I think in that first stage, it's messy. You're throwing stuff against the wall. I mean, every song starts the same with me where I go, I don't know what I'm doing. This sounds like garbage. And then something clicks and it hits this point, and then it's just process of elimination. It's just bam, bam, bam. The song will begin to tell me what it needs, and it writes itself.
Okay, very cool. Oh, I just remembered we have a couple of questions from the rock stars, so I will inject these now. This one comes from Daniel Walker, and he says, I think this may or may not be a serious question, but he said, is there such thing as Americana EDM asking for a friend? What do you want to say about that? I think that's actually a great question, because I think there certainly is the possibility for these crossover genres of like, wouldn't it be cool to do EDM in this genre?
Yeah, I guess it depends how you define Americana. Like, is that like the folk influence? I mean, that's how I started doing music, was cross-pollinating folk singer-songwriters and electronic dance music. It wasn't even called EDM back then. But I think the records that grab people the most are ones where you're bringing these two sort of contrarian genres of music together, and then seeing what overlaps in that Venn diagram. Like, it was these earthy, sort of rustic sawdust vocals of Lissy in my song The Longest Road, mixed with more synthetic elements that were a contrast. And it wasn't the typical singer you'd feature on an electronic record. So I think you have to be a little contrarian in your combinations of music for people to notice. Otherwise, it just sounds like a photocopy of something else.
Right. Yeah. I was just actually rediscovering a mix I did a while ago where I took a recording of me and my daughter singing Jingle Bells, and then I did a remix with Frank Sinatra and put some drum beats behind it, and it actually turned out okay. It was fun to do. Yeah. So yeah, I think that is a lot of fun to just mess around with that kind of stuff. And then, I haven't heard, let's see, what's a genre you don't think you have heard? Have you heard bluegrass and EDM mixed together?
Yeah, I feel like with Avicii, with some of the stuff he did, where he had banjos and some of the songs and actually had live players on them. I think he could have explored more with that. I was expecting him to. So I think there was like a folk EDM, folk house movement that was brewing, but not a lot of other guys hopped on that train, which was interesting.
Yeah. And I certainly have heard, I feel like, Eastern European music, Middle Eastern music, like quickly attached itself to EDM, and it was a great fit, Yeah, like DJ Snake with his Algerian influences. It's really interesting. It really does work, because those scales just work. How about anything from Asia, from China, stuff that might, like traditional stuff where we almost, as with a Western ear, don't even understand the music when we first hear it. Have you heard any mix mashups that way?
I'm starting to hear, I mean, I used to tour China a lot before the whole pandemic went down. And a funny thing happened though. I was in Shanghai on tour and I heard what I thought was banjo music. I thought it was bluegrass, but it was Chinese traditional folk. And I heard it like in this dumpling house and thinking, oh my God, this plucking, these instruments sound exactly like American bluegrass. It was so weird. And I was just thinking, man, are these just cycles? Like, do people create these genres all like simultaneously? Or like, how does it that people are creating the same instruments in very different cultures and the same sounds, same timbres? Because there's only so many ways you can build, you can tighten a guitar string. But,
right.
But it made me think though, like that there's interesting parallels between these music cultures that have developed independent of each other.
Yeah. And then I feel terrible. I'm trying to remember the name of the band. It's an EDM mixed with Native American singing something red.
Huh.
Do you know these guys? Hopefully somebody's listening and they're going, come on, Lidge.
But Kashmir has done a lot of Asian influence. I mean, his family's from Nepal, I think. And so he's mixed a lot of some Bollywood influence, just some of those scales. I mean, it feels Middle Eastern, but it's more Indian influence.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's your answer, Daniel. Yes. They're Americana EDM equals yes.
I do think though, super important point though. I think that country and electronic, not just bluegrass, but country and electronic stuff is, there's so much you could do with that. And yeah. I'm messing around with some stuff. Like it's very expensive to get a slide guitar. So I finally found a plugin that is close-ish, that I just started to use, but man, there's not many plugins for slide guitar. I don't remember. You
just need to come to Nashville, dude. We'll set you up.
Yeah, you really need you need a player for it. It doesn't have you can get a really cool way. The chord voicing sound really cool playing on a keyboard, but just better to have a player.
Yeah. All right. So here's a question from Jarrell Pearson. Is it recommended to go to raves for inspiration? I think that's a legit question. I guess it basically touches on the idea of, to make EDM, do you sort of have to understand the context of dancing to it yourself?
I think it's helpful. I used to just go to clubs for research, and I wasn't really a big dancer. I just was kind of shy growing up. I grew up in Vermont, and there wasn't a ton of nightclubs, but people would come through town on their way to bigger cities. It was an in-between stop, and it was fun to see that energy, just to hear stuff on the system too. And it also, beyond just seeing how it affects the crowd, you're also hearing what, like with mono versus stereo, like seeing what disappears from the mix. Is it a lot of these venues would be mono only, and nobody really talks about that, but that's a big thing to consider. You got to make sure your mix is mono friendly. It's always going to be a compromise, but
let's talk about that a little bit. So, we might understand in the studio that when you put a spatial effect on something, you may want to check it in mono to make sure the effect's still there. But I've heard that if you're doing EDM, there are effects that may be affecting down, below 300, 100 hertz down into the low frequencies. And you can really mess your club track up if you put something out of phase down in the low end, right?
Yeah, totally. And I'll try to typically limit my effects to those higher bands. And it's interesting because for a while, you can get too conservative. You can be like, all right, well, we're not going to have anything stereo in the mix. And it's just a matter of balancing the mid and the sides. And it's not saying don't have any side content, but just make sure it's balanced so that the whole mix doesn't change drastically when it gets summed to mono. So it's like this yin yang of the mids are that core, and then the sides are kind of the ear candy. But you got to have both.
Yeah. Okay. And then I guess as far as the low end goes, maybe just set up your mix in such a way that there's no chance you're going to accidentally put something phasey in the low frequencies.
Yeah, and I what I like to do in my mixes is make sure that the compressors, I didn't use this till recently, but make sure the compressors are not triggered by the low end information as much. But it sounds like a contradiction to sidechaining to the kick. But if I'm doing my master mix, like an SSL compressor, I'll put a high pass filter on the trigger, so it's not reacting to maybe up to, let's say, 200 hertz. That it's excluding that information from the trigger otherwise it's just going to compress the mix too much. So you can get a lot more power that way, just bypassing the some of the low end information on there. But the most important thing is have a very focused low end. Don't try, like if you're doing distortion, maybe just distort the low mids up and don't distort those low fundamentals.
Mm-hmm.
So you see that with a lot of soft synths like Serum. They let you, with one button, you can bypass all the effects on the low end.
You know, it's interesting because there's a guitar player named Obad Khan in St. Louis, and many 30 years ago when I saw him play through an incredible guitar and amp combo, and I was talking to him about the distortion of his guitar amp, that's what he said to me. He said the secret of a great sounding guitar amp, I think it was a Vox AC30, was that it distorted the highs but not the lows. So the lows were always clean, but the crunch and the bite came from just the highs. And I think that sounds similar to what you just described, you know?
Yeah, and I think I'm still learning more about what distortion does. Like, I think distortion is way more complicated than a lot of people realize, that it can create not just overtones and add texture, but undertones. So you could be messing with the key of the notes that you're playing. By putting too much distortion on the low end, you could really wreck the structure of the harmonics of the song.
Right.
So it's like, you always probably cut some of the lows after with an amp modeling plugin or distortion. But it's always a battle to figure out like what's going to add the flavor. And that's where the parallel mixing stuff comes in handy. Just because you want texture and you want sound that's going to translate to different speakers. And distortion usually does it because it's very easy to think, great, this will sound great on studio monitors, but what's your audience listening on? They're listening on Amazon Echoes.
Right. For EDM, no less.
Yeah. Hopefully not too much EDM on there, but that is like the most popular speaker in the country, I think. So you got to consider your destination.
Yeah. All right. So what tips do you have for getting the low end right for those of us who don't have the big focals and we don't have a club to test it in? Maybe it's a dumb question. Maybe it's like, well, if you don't hear it in a club, it doesn't matter. But are there any smart ways for people to get pretty close with much smaller sort of home studio speakers?
I think it's funny because I don't think having big speakers helps me at all. Honestly, I like working on them. They flatter it a little too much. So I think I have some Avantone mix cubes that are pretty good.
Yeah.
That's more for getting the vocal level and just hearing the mids, but I want my mix to sound expensive on those. And I'm not really sure what it is that translates. I think it's just texture and harmonics. But I heard a quote recently. It's like you want the maximum emotion with minimal bandwidth. That was one of the quick tips where you're really just juggling voltage with music, with recorded music. And you've got to be able to convey this illusion through small speakers without a lot of power.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what's the point? So I think to get that bass, working on headphones actually does work for a lot of artists. I know a lot of big DJs in the EDM world, and they don't even use monitors, and they don't have fancy converters. They have a laptop. They have some headphones they trust, and they do incredible work. They do better work than I can do on $10,000 monitors.
I think I remember hearing Skrillex talk about that back in the day too. And I guess a question for you though is, as you find headphones that you trust, what volume are those people typically listening to their headphones at? Are they cranked while they're doing that, or are they also mixing really low level?
I think they're mixing low level, but I definitely know some guys are cranking them, and I think in general, it's not great for your ears to have headphones on them for 12 hours a day. That is the one real negative with headphones. But I do love it with headphones where you've eliminated the problem of the acoustics of your room. And there's some plugins like Waves NX. There's things that can spatialize them better, so they're a little more accurate. But I don't know. There's a lot of products that are sold that you don't really need. I think it's more about having good source material, good ideas, good samples, really good processing chains, and then the rest is sort of complicate to profit, and people want to sell you a lot of plugins and gear you don't need.
All right. So you've kind of answered this, but I'll ask it again. How loud is loud enough? Does loudness actually prevent low end from getting in there? And how loud should we make our EDM mix?
It's a good question, because I really went deep down this rabbit hole of how loud should you mix for streaming services, because they're penalizing you for having really loud mixes. So you could do all this work to hit, -4 or -6 LUFS, really loud EDM track, and then they're just going to pull it down on across the board, YouTube, Spotify, everything. So for a while I was thinking, maybe do you bounce down an alternate mix that's quieter, and then that is messy as well, because you've got delivery to all these services. You got to have a consistent mix you deliver. So what I came to in the end was you need your loud mix for club DJs, and you will benefit from a quieter, more dynamic mix for Spotify, but don't overdo it, because pumping through a limiter, that's part of the feel, and the edge of the mix is your processing and having it loud. That's part of club music. And if you try to mix too clinically, it's not going to have the same impact, and no one will be happy.
Like if you're too careful, it just won't feel right.
Yeah. So just like, I think the best approach is just leaving a little room. Maybe instead of trying to hit -4, you do -6, or instead of -6, you do -8.
Which is great, because for rock, Americana or rock bands, we'd probably go like, oh my God, that's so loud.
Yeah. It's interesting because that loudness, it's not super accurate in terms of the way Spotify keeps changing their system. So
Thanks,
the target
Spotify.
the target keeps moving. It was -14, and it's not even totally accurate. They'll change the software they use. So I think you really just have to have a well-recorded and well-mixed record. That's number one. That's going to be way more important than your LUFS. And your LUFS also is very relative to the arrangement of the song, the tempo of the song, what frequencies are you using, distortion. So it's so complex, all these other factors that, some of these records, the way they're mixed, are going to sound much louder, irrelevant of the LUFS. So I think it's a good, very basic guideline for looking at your records. But what I try to do just across the board is when I'm processing my stems or my tracks, I try to bring the peaks down, bring the RMS up for tracks. So I'm getting a little more emotion out of the samples and sounds, making sure the mix is balanced, and just making sure that the parts are right. Because if you have a crappy kick drum, it doesn't matter how much limiting you're doing, it's not going to fix the problem. It's just going to amplify it.
Yeah, it's cool. Almost seems like there's some kind of rule in there that, the emotion lives in the RMS.
Yeah, there's something to be said for it. Like, you can push it and then just bring it down on the other side of the fader.
PreSonus has everything you need for your music or podcast production. Studio One is a great choice for your DAW, whether you are writing songs, creating EDM and pop music, recording bands, mixing, mastering, composing for film, or recording voice and producing a podcast of your own. A flexible sketchpad, chord charts, key recognition, effects pedals, amp simulators, virtual instruments including a killer drum machine, built-in vocal tuning with Melodyne, and 37 fantastic sounding plugins for mixing will allow you to create whatever inspires you. PreSonus provides you everything you need for your studio, from microphone to digital interface to headphones and speakers, so that you can easily set up your home studio for professional production. Get started now with the low-cost Studio One Artist and join PreSonus Sphere for access to all their software, a complete learning library, and creative collaboration in the community at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. If your goal was to climb Mount Everest, you would hire a Sherpa to guide you to the summit. If you wanted to sail around the world, you would hire a seasoned sea captain for a safe voyage. And if you wanted to try skydiving, you wouldn't just jump out of an airplane without being strapped to an expert, right? So why would you send off your mix for mastering without knowing that it was ready first? Wouldn't it be great to have a professional mastering engineer with a trained ear to guide you through the final stages of mixing? Brian Murphy is your trusted guide at soundporter.com. home of the iterative mastering process, where you get to interact with a professional mastering engineer who listens to what you want and will give you mix feedback to help you get your mix ready for mastering. Contact Brian now for a free mix review and mastering demo so that you can hear it before you buy it at soundporter.com. All right, well, so there's another sound that you have in your productions. I guess I don't know what else to call it. I call it the bass dive. It's sort of like just before the breakdown, the bass just goes. There's two artists up, Fire, or two songs, tracks that you sent, Fire and Someone to Love You. Both had this, I think, and the bass just kind of just goes way down. And then we're just waiting, and then we're about to hit the drop. What is that? And how might we want to create or use a musical part like that? And then the other question is, how the hell do we hear it if we're creating it? It's so low, you know?
Yeah, it's super low. It's super effective, and it can take over the whole mix. So what I do, I really want little individual elements and moments in the arrangement to shine. So like drum fills can get lost very easily, and those sub drops can get lost if you have a bass line on top of that sub drop. So typically I'll get them from sample packs. It's just super easy because it takes some time you're doing a pitch bend. You're doing they usually have a little bit of a kick in them, and then it's a long pitch bend. Just easier to have someone else do that. It's window dressing, so it's not the core of your song. So Kashmir does a lot of really good sub drops. I use his almost exclusively. And they just work on the dance floor because you've got these big subs, and it's a clear marker because when you're making dance music, you want stuff that will mix well into other tracks. So you do all these little tricks, like every 16 bars, you have something new that's introduced. You have little turnarounds that introduce the change between the sections. And then I'll use those sub drops in a breakdown where there's more space. So I'll mute the bass line. I'll put the sub drop in there. So it's a marker that says, hey, this is the breakdown. You should be transitioned out of the other song by now.
Yeah, otherwise we wouldn't even hear it. It'd just be covered up by stuff, right?
You wouldn't hear it. But and the cool part of the bend, instead of it just being a static 40 hertz or whatever, you're hearing this dynamic bend to it, and it's rattling your pants and your shirt as you're hearing it on a big system.
Yeah, well, it's interesting.
Which is really important.
You talk about splice, for example, and then getting these, getting sub drops from Kashmir. Thank you for correcting me. They're not called bass dives, Lidge. They're called sub drops.
You could you call them whatever you want. It is a bass dive.
All right. But it's this idea of using something that is already, some of the work has already been done. So for example, if I was going to take a band into the studio with two guitars, bass, drums, and a singer, we wouldn't feel compelled to have to build the guitars from scratch before the session, And it sounds like in EDM, you can use tools like that. I guess you call them samples, right? So you can just use samples and insert them in, and you're creating with those. Those are like your instruments.
Yeah, and I think it's all in the category of window dressing where my builds, my snare builds, effect builds, impacts, rips, risers, sub drops, things that I don't want to be spending as much time on, but are still important. And they're pushing the song forward. They're creating distinct sections in the arrangement, and they're adding intensity. You need transitional effects to glue these sections together and have you anticipate something happening. It's also good for tension. So I like having those done ahead of time. If you use too many of them, they're too recognizable. It can pull someone out of the song. But I think that's more producers hearing other producers and going, oh, I know that loop or I know that sample. Yeah.
Now, do you ever do dubstep, or is that a style that you don't do intentionally?
I don't do any dubstep. I mean, it's so sound design focused. It's all about your automating your LFOs, and really, it's just a different tempo too. Like,
right. Interesting.
Yeah, doing that halftime tempo. So I do everything from 100 to 128. And these days you can do more varied tempo stuff, but once you commit to that tempo, you're kind of locked in. That's going to change. If you change the tempo, it's going to really affect the vibrato of the singer. It's going to affect the space of the mix, the groove, the loops, the quality of the samples that are going to need to be rewarped.
It's so fascinating to realize that as an EDM producer, you can sort of you can live within a certain tempo range like that. But I guess if it was a band, you're a punk band, you live in the high tempo range, and if you're a slow folk band, you live in a low tempo range. So that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Vocals, you have a vocal chain there where you work with singers. How often do you actually work with a singer yourself and record it that way, or versus having somebody send you something? I guess you said people are recording remotely, and then you have remixes. Maybe you want to explain to us, like, what does a remix mean today, and how does that process work?
Yeah, typically what we'll do is I find producers that I love what they're doing. I love their sounds, and I'll hire them to remix my music. I'll give them the stems. Usually they just need the vocal, and maybe sometimes they'll get the MIDI piano parts for the chords. But I basically, it's like, here's the vocal, do your magic. And the goal is have them make a mix that elevates it and takes it to different markets. It creates new life for the song. So it's a marketing tool, but also it's catalog. It's a new way to re-envision your music and reach different fans. And sometimes they'll make a better version. You got to be okay with your own ego enough to say, hey, you know what? Like, go and crush this and, blow my mix out of the park.
I feel like remix as a concept came from an era of, a pop song is done in a certain style and then the vocal stripped out, and now it's delivered to you with this completely different take on it. But it almost seems like remixes today, like the song may have been intended for a 4 on the floor and been something close. And so maybe it's, as you're describing, more about just lending a new kind of excitement to the mix itself.
Yeah. It's, you want the song to have a long life. And if it's a good song, it's going to work in acoustic form, on piano, on guitar, like you could remix it like that. I'll even do acoustic mixes so that it can get on different playlists on Spotify. You don't want playlists driving your creative process, but it is nice to have alternate versions of songs so that it can be licensed to film, TV, video games, and even fitness now. I'm doing music for, like, people are doing music for Calm and Peloton and Nike.
I mean, I have to confess here that I listen to EDM and dubstep every single day when I'm working out. So
nice.
I totally get it.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, how likely is it, for example, that you would do a remix of Adele Hello or something like that, a totally different genre of song, but then remixed with a 4 on the floor kind of thing?
I think you always want material for your sets, and sometimes I'll ask the major labels for stems, even if I'm not doing an official mix. I'll ask for stems so I can just have some weapons for the dance floor, especially in Vegas where they
like weapons for the dance floor. That's
it's cannon fodder, and you need familiar. You can't just like go and play random underground tracks for Vegas. It's you go out there, you've got to entertain some strangers. Yeah, it's core fans and also strangers that you've got to win over, no matter how big you are.
People still want to know the song already.
Yeah, and they like to be surprised and hear it in a different context, and that's the best part of doing mashups and remixes. So that's a fun way that I like to do it. I use a thing called mixed in key, which is essential, where I drop all my songs into it. It tells me the tempo, tells me the key, and then I know what songs will be good mashups with other songs too.
So mixed in key, is this a separate app or a plugin?
Yeah, it's a standalone app. Use it almost every day the past 10 years.
Very cool. All right. So that I think goes in the same folder where you go find Stereo Monoizer. To, break down stems that people deliver to you for mixing also. Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Now, when people do send you vocals, is it typical that you might auto-tune them a whole lot more? You did mention earlier in this interview about auto-tuning lightly. But my question was sort of like, should we be considering getting bolder with autotune, especially those of us who grew up when autotune first arrived on the scene?
Yeah, and I was partially kidding too with autotune. Yeah. Like I do it pretty heavy. I don't want to hear that, like that warble of it. I'll change the retune. I'll pull back a little bit, but very reliant on autotune for sure. I love it. I love the effect of it.
And
all
just
hard tuned.
Antares for you, or do you sort of use a whole suite of tuning plugins for stuff like that?
Antares, I'm just lazy, and that's easier than penciling it in. I like Melodyne, but I actually use Melodyne more for instruments and timing. I just think, if you start to process things that get a little too grainy sounding, too much with things like Melodyne, so you got to be careful. But yeah, I like Autotune, and it's great to use in two different ways. A lot of hip hop guys are tracking with it on, and it's giving them more of this melodic staircase so they can work their way through the scales and get melodic ideas.
Yep.
It's helpful. It's a songwriting tool, but I think with my singers, we don't track with Autotune on. And I hate to say it, but I don't even listen back to the take without Autotune on. We'll do a great take. I'll put just a touch of Autotune on. I'll try to record here if we have a session, an in-person session, and those are delayed for a little while. But I just get such a good sound in my own studio. And I know that it's going through some good gear and it's being tracked right, but it's also more tedious because you got to comp all the vocals,
right?
Which is a pain. But it's like someone's got to pick those good takes.
Now, are you using Ableton Live for the vocal recording, or are you going to Pro Tools for that and comping there and then coming back to Ableton? How do you like to do all that stuff?
All in Ableton. I used to use Pro Tools for everything. Then I did Pro Tools just for vocal tracking, and then I just do everything in Ableton. I don't really need the playlist feature as much. It's very easy to overdo and do too many takes, and then you don't even know. You might even lose your best takes with just too many tracks and having to freeze plugins. So I think the workflow is everything, and surprisingly, Ableton's pretty solid with the vocals. You have less options with fades and things like that, but there's recent improvements that have made it much better for vocals.
What about vocal effects? What are some cool vocal effect mixing tricks that you might want to share with us? And then I feel like when I listen to some of your mixes, I hear you're not just sort of like looking for a static balance of the right amount of delay and reverb or something. You're like constantly changing things up with the vocal and keeping it interesting. So I wondered if you just want to talk about the way you like to think about that and stay creative.
Yeah. I love to do reverb throws and echo throws where you're doing a temporary, like really aggressive send to it and letting that reverb shine. Recently I've been doing stuff with 100% or 90% wet reverbs. It glues things together, and I think it's a really underrated technique. Throw it through like a Soundtoys little plate, one of the most incredible reverb plugins, or any of the UAD plates or spring reverbs.
Are you using some of the Eventide reverbs, Black Hole?
No, I haven't messed around with that stuff. I do know they make great stuff.
Yeah, those are great too.
What else do I do? There's some fun tricks. I need to try this more often, but like having a secondary mic that's just for effects that's off to the side from a singer. So maybe you have your main mic that's getting tracked, and then you have like your B mic, and then that's going through its own effect chain. That's
and you might actually mess with it while they're singing.
Yeah, you can mess with it while they're singing. There's definitely an art to keeping it simple while you're tracking, and you're not flattering them. You want them to sound good, but you also want them to be accurately hearing their own performance and not hearing too much reverb. It depends on the preference, but I think there's a lot to that. That headphone mix is important. Other effects, I like to have delays and then feeding that delay into a reverb. And just making sure they're good quality reverbs. I don't like the reverb in Ableton, even though some guys get amazing results with that. I like EMT 140, the BX20, those UAD ones, the Capital Chambers, Ocean Way Studios. I think that's what I love with good hardware-driven software. Like the UAD stuff is great for reverbs. Yeah,
I haven't heard the Capital Chambers yet, but Steve Genowick was on the show to talk about making those plugins, which was pretty fun to hear.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the bass, kick drum and bass parts and sustain. What do you want to say about how long these things are supposed to be right?
I think a lot of that is controlled by Shaperbox. I use this plugin called Shaperbox 2 that has volume shaper in it, and I can really pencil in the volume of things. So one of the coolest techniques with that is you can say, I want the shape of the kick to look like this, and then I'm going to invert that and then apply that to the bass. So that the bass knows exactly, rather than responding to just the MIDI note for the kick or the sample itself, you're trimming the kick, and then you're shaping a slow attack on the bass so that they're complementary. So the sounds just merge together.
That's cool. I don't remember what song it was, but I remember hearing a story about one of the disco tracks or something like that back in the day, where they took the piece of tape, the 2-inch tape off, and they rocked, the tape across the heads first before taking the tape off. Sorry. They rocked the tape across the heads, found the exact start of each kick drum, marked it, and then they went in with a razor blade and they literally cut little windows out of the tape before the kick drum so that the bass would only happen whenever the kick drum happened, no matter what was played.
Huh. That's crazy.
So getting the kick and the bass to be tight and work together has been around for a minute. So that's great.
It's an ongoing balance too, of where even if it sounds like the kick and the bass are hitting at the same time, they're not really. Like, it's micro timing. Like, the kick is hitting just before the bass. So it sounds like they're one cohesive whole, but they're really just melded together, and you're hearing time is spreading out the sounds.
Yeah. The secret to a great mix is to start with great source tracks. And this means you need great microphones. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia brings you the new BB29 Signature Series microphone to help your recordings add clarity and detail to your mixes. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique Golden Drop capsule design with a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity without distracting colorations and distortions. The new BB29 microphone has a Class A discrete amplifier circuit, extremely low self-noise, and transformer-coupled output to bring an expensive sound to your studio for an affordable price. JZ offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, you can use the coupon code ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the BB29 at jzmic.com. The legendary API sound can be described as punchy and bold with a distinct in-your-face presence. For more than 50 years, API Audio has been advancing their design of consoles, mic preamps, compressors, and EQs. But what API founder Saul Walker got perfect in the very beginning were the proprietary op-amp and transformer designs. And today, API still offers the very best for your studio with dedicated rack units for mic pre, EQ, and compression, and consoles from small to large with the Box 1608, 2448, or full-size Legacy Access, and they even introduced the original 500 series lunchbox to studios everywhere. But most importantly of all, no matter which gear you choose from API, you can count on the original op-amps and transformer designs to make sure you always get that legendary API sound. Because the next record you make could be your best record ever. Visit apiaudio.com. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Want to start mastering your own records? Rockstars of Mastering walks you through exactly how I mastered my own record using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. Want to learn how to create a mix that doesn't suck but rocks instead? At Mixmaster Bundle, I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins so that you can have punchy, powerful drums, guitars that rock, bass you can feel, and a mix that is in your face. Plus, it's totally free as my way of saying thanks for listening. Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now and look for the clickable link in the show notes below. Okay, cool. So then I know I'm kind of jumping around, but I'm just following my questions here too. On the topic of remix again, what are some things that you might ask for before starting a remix? Is it just vocals with no effects on them? Or are there some basic elements that you want to always ask for?
I usually ask the label for the lead vocal, and I like to get wet and dry versions for it, if possible. And I like to keep the backgrounds separate. So if the backgrounds are in a separate stem, that's ideal because I'll often change the chord voicings of the song. So a lot of these pop remixes, they're major key. They're not. They're kind of missing some tension that I want to add, some melancholy that I want to have in an electronic version. So I'll go through and redo the voicing. So if I can mute the background vocals, it's much easier.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. And then you were saying that you might ask for key elements. So if there was like a cool guitar riff or something like that, and you're going to want that as well. Like recognizable stuff, like the things that give that song recognition.
Yeah. If you go in, I mean, the downside is if you use too many of the stems and your remix gets rejected, then it's hard to repurpose it for one of your originals. So that's like an old standby. Sometimes I want a remix to get rejected because I like the musical body I've built around the song.
That's cool.
But usually you want to get paid and you want the approved remix. So yeah, if there's good signature elements that really propel it, that is great. You know, I remember I did a remix for Stevie Nicks and they said, okay, she's already turned down 5 mixes. So don't get too crazy with it. Like really embrace the stems, which is nobody ever says that. So I did it and the mix got approved, but it was stand back.
So embrace the stems means you really kept the original intent of the song in the remix. It didn't change it too much.
Right.
Okay. See, I'm learning. I promise I'm learning on this. Okay, cool. Are there any other effects plugins that you want to give a shout out to or any fun stuff you've been messing around with or just been excited about?
I think I touched on Gullfoss and Soothe. I really like everything that FabFilter is doing. I just started messing around with Saturn 2. And what else have I been into? Yeah, a lot of the Universal Audio stuff. What else has been really crucial? Oh, Distressor. I love the Distressor.
And Sound Toys, you're using those a lot or two as well?
Yeah.
So probably...
I like to have, if my Desert Island compressor would be the Distressor.
Have you been using the Arouser or the UAD Distressor?
Yeah, the UAD one.
Yeah.
That's been awesome. And I've heard that sounds just as good as the hardware. Oh, and it's not software, but there's this thing called they call it the Daft Punk compressor, and it's $60.
Is it the Alesis 3630 that I've got down here in the rack?
Dude, I love that thing so much. I'm using it. I'm busting stuff in Ableton out to that and back and parallel blending it.
Wow.
And I keep double checking it. I'm like, God, that can't be right. Like I must be just cranking the volume too much, but I have it, it's easy to just make things louder and it's not better, but it does something to loops and percussive samples that I don't know what you like to use it for, but it's very underrated.
I just like to use it to brag about it on the podcast. I need to start using it more. I have a whole bunch of gear here that needs to show up at the patch base so that, we can start using it more. And I think it's cool to hear you bring that up.
It's funny because I think if you search for it on like Gear Sluts and I don't know, the less time I spend on those type of forums, the better.
Yeah.
But there's just very strong opinions. But people will bash something like this, and they could steer you away from a really cool piece of gear. And this has more flavor and grit. Like everything sounds more interesting through it. We'll see if I start integrating it more in the workflow. But I'll just take splice loops and run it through, and it just everything sounds wider. Doesn't sound overly crushed. Everything just sounds like it has this mojo to it. So I don't know. It's easy to. I think it's a lot of producers will put too much energy into compressors and A/Bing things, and you really should be spending more time on composition and songwriting. But it's fun to it's fun to do some deep dives every once in a while.
Well, it's fun to just play around with physical gear in the studio because it's it's fun.
Yeah. And what's coming actually today in the mail? I bought one of those Chase Bliss pedals.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Have you seen this thing? It's their preamp pedal, but it shows you the presets with physical faders. So as you switch between your presets, it's a guitar pedal, but it'll go through and all the faders are motorized. And I think that's how they're going to make all their guitar pedals from now on, even the next Reverb one. So you have this tactile feedback, and then you can also control it with a MIDI expression pedal. So you can automate your guitar pedal that's hardware.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll take all the old synths and do that to it. And then before you know it, you'll be taking out your MPC 2000 to gigs again.
Right.
So that brings us back to the question of drum parts again for this stuff. You talked about laying stuff out on the grid. How often do you use like a drum pad kind of tool to play things in by hand? Is that very rare that you might do that? Or is that common?
It's rare, but I have a push 2 for Ableton, which I love. And sometimes you just need to work with that intention of having something in your workflow, like A, make sure it's hooked up, and B, that it's in a good stand next to you. So I have that now with a push, and I'll use that more for melodies. So with my left hand, I'll play triad chords, and then with my right, I'll play the leads, and I'll just do different voicings that way, just to sort of break down the chord voicing process.
Yeah.
It's good for drums too. It's great for drums, but usually drums I just throw on the grid manually.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Let's jump back to some questions about these quick tips, because you had so many great things in there. And before we sort of close out on the podcast here, and again, Rockstars, these beautiful OWC cards that I've got in front of me are really cool looking, and the graphic images are awesome, man. Are you a graphic designer as well? I mean, did you create each one of these graphic images from scratch?
No, I brought in an illustrator. It was a long search to find the right person and to find like what was the way to express these tips, because these are some of them are kind of abstract ideas and philosophical methods and mental models. So eventually we tried a bunch of different versions that were they were like skeuomorphic. They were too literal and too cartoony. But I wanted something that was actionable, and like I love the Brian Eno oblique strategy cards. I'm a big fan of those.
Yeah.
But I don't use them because they're not colorful. They're not visual. I have them. They're great, but they're just very vague, and they can be very helpful. But I wanted to create a version that was a little more actionable. So these have these very clean vector illustrations. And I feel like with music, we finally figured out like, geometric figures can express musical ideas much better than, painting a picture. So simple line form and just using colors was a way to express sort of the math of music.
So now, did you intend for these cards to be part of your creative process? So for example, like an oblique strategy card, would you just pull one out and say, for the next move I'm going to base it on this? Or is it, they seem to be more like, like quick tips, like really good tips for how you can have a great session and run your studio well and be creative in the studio and all that.
Yeah, it's all how you use them. And I think the way I like to do it is pull out maybe 3 cards to focus on. Maybe it's a way to narrow down your focus. But I think you have to be deliberate in the way you use them. And you could shuffle the deck. You could use it as a randomization tool. But I think, if you're in the middle of a session and you shuffle it and you pull out a color coding card, that might not be the best tip for that time in the session. So I think you'd pull out some things you want to work on and focus on that day. It's really just a way they're little reminders and little creative dilemmas. So it's a way to just shuffle the process so it's less linear and you'll get different ideas for how to improve your workflow.
All right. So now here's a couple again. One is called Basic Backup. Use the 3-2-1 backup. Do you want to talk about that card? And the card has this beautiful image of a pyramid of triangles with a little bit of a cloud at the top.
Yeah, that one is definitely more, it's like maintenance and upkeep. Whereas some of the tips are more philosophical and creative and compositional. So the point with this one is that I saw a lot of producers that didn't keep backups. And I was actually at the Apple store the other day, a year ago, and this guy he'd lost 4 terabytes of data because he didn't trust Dropbox. He thought it was going to get hacked into. And I just think it's just crazy. A lot of DJs don't do proper backups. So you need to have a physical backup, cloud backup. You need to have some redundancy in there, and you need to have a system that continually backs up on its own. So that's crucial. And a lot of guys only have one form of backup.
Right. So say that again. So you've got your master, and then you've got a physical backup, and then you've got a cloud backup.
Right.
I like to also, so I guess that is what I do. So if I move something off the work drives, I'll put them on an archive drive and I'll have the master and the backup, but I don't always have the cloud backup of that one. But I recently just reinstated Backblaze so that I at least have, for whatever's being worked on now, there's a master, there's a backup internally in the computer, and then there's the Backblaze backup also.
Yeah, I do wish that Dropbox would offer a physical drive with backups.
Yeah.
Right now, it's the select sync options for these cloud services are great, but what happens if they go out of business? How can you get your data back in a physical form? I mean, I think Backblaze or a couple other companies were offering that service, but maybe not now because people use so much more data these days.
Yeah. All right. So here's a couple of other cards, and let's see which one we can do. So I apologize because I got to put on my reading glasses if I'm going to read them at the same time. So here's one called Gut versus Logic, and it's got these beautiful curved semicircles on there. Outpace left brain logic with faster gut decisions by working early in the morning or late at night when the logic brain is weak. Occupy the left brain with repetitive kinetic motion activities like walking, running, and showering to free the creative mind. That's great.
It sounds so basic, but it's funny. And people think that they're just a special snowflake and they only work at night or in the morning. And it applies to everybody. I've realized after just seeing how everybody works, it's not a question of if you're a night owl or a morning person. It's that there is a black hole in the middle of the day. It's not an excuse not to work, but like right now is time for calls, for emails, administrative work. You can be creative, but it's not going to be as juicy as the morning or the night. It's just the way your body works. And it's the way the chemicals are being released in the circadian rhythm of your brain. So it's like trying to defy physics and trying to fight against gravity. You can work with it, or you can work against it and make it more difficult.
You know, it's funny. Sometimes I can get really creative if I stay up too late. If it's almost time for bed, then I'm just thinking I want to go to sleep. But if I pull some kind of late night session with my friends or, working on music, then all of a sudden the creativity does switch on. And it seems like it's the same thing in the morning. Right when I wake up on normal hours, I tend to just want coffee and stuff. I mean, I am feeling pretty creative, but I wonder if it's that same thing. Like if you wake up even earlier, like too early, maybe you're even more creative in the morning.
I think that if I were to prioritize morning or night, I would say if you could get up early in the morning, it improves everything. And I'm not a morning person necessarily, but
well, you just played a club all night long.
Yeah. And I've gotten used to that lifestyle, although I've had to go back to a regular lifestyle now without touring. But if you get up at least an hour earlier, I think you gain 2 hours of productivity at least during the day. Just something about the momentum. And I heard it's also about the dopamine release in your brain. I don't know if it's true or not, but that you've just got more ammo for the day early on. And then you're fatigued from decisions and noise and all the other obstacles that the day brings.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So then let's see. Here's one. The secret is the sequence. What do you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's just like cooking. It's if you start with the right ingredients, start with the right samples, but also when are you using those samples? So if I'm starting with the kick and then I go straight to the clap, I'm going to have a whole different beat than if I do kick and then the hi-hat, because that's going to inform the next stage of the rhythm.
Okay, interesting. All right,
and
cool.
Same with composition as well. So if I start with the chords and then I move and then I do bass and then lead, it's going to sound different than doing chord then lead then bass.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking about writing a song on an acoustic guitar and then going into the studio and then having to figure out how to do it on electric guitar. There are those similar things. The instrument you start on can really inform what happens next.
Yeah, especially with the interface of, I love how with guitars, you can play a chord 6 different ways or 5 different ways, and they're all different shapes. So you can stumble on to more creative accidents than piano. Now,
when you're producing EDM, how often do you tear all the faders down? Like that classic studio move where you just like start over. The music's there, but you're starting the mix over.
I should probably do it more often. I think that would be helpful to rebuild the mix. I think what happens with electronic music in DAWs like Ableton is you leave all your faders static and you're just doing your gain staging in the plugins, and they're all at -6 or whatever, but they're like redlining before that. So it's you want to avoid that. But I think a lot of these problems, they could be fixed with the basics, changing the attack, the decay, the release, the velocity, the panning, the volume leveling versus putting a plugin on them.
Now, how and where do you go create dynamic moves? You're doing these throws for the vocal and stuff like that, and some of them are pretty complicated. Like there's a bunch of effects that are changing. Do you find that there are clever ways for you to do that more easily versus stuff that feels awkward, or are you just so comfortable with the mouse that you can sort of write each automation move in and arrive at what feels inspired to you?
Yeah, it's all mouse automation, and it's tedious. That probably takes up a third of the time. 2/3 just automation and making sure that you're building towards the drop and you're building anticipation and you're opening and closing filters. Increasing tension. It takes a lot of time to pencil those in. Mm-hmm. Probably the better way to do it is just ride a knob and get a more humanized movement, something that's not just a straight line. So I think there's a lot to be said for using curves, using exponential curves, but performing it, with the mod wheel or the pitch bend wheel.
Interesting. Okay, so those are good ones. So Ableton will let you take any MIDI input and sort of guide any knob on there if you want it to.
Yeah. Almost any will snap to the controls in the plugin without having to. That's right. Yeah.
That's very cool because I know my non-Ableton Pro Tools can be a bit of a challenge for that and for some of the plugins.
It's weird that they never. I don't know. Maybe I guess you said it's a little easier now with the menus. But.
It's a little easier. It seems like some virtual instruments seem to want to accept MIDI inputs, and I think that plugins don't. Or some of them do. And I don't want to say that wrong, but I really like the idea of having knobs just control what I'm seeing on the screen. And it's surprisingly challenging to do that, or you have to get potentially a pretty expensive controller. But anyway, so you talked about doing those moves can be time consuming. So last question about the quick tips here, batching tracks or batching tasks, excuse me.
Yeah.
So that sounds like that's part of it. And if you want to elaborate on what it means to batch tasks and have that be effective.
Yeah, I think it's really key. I mean, it's like if you're doing a podcast, I do podcasts on Tuesdays usually.
Nice.
And I think you like that as well. So it's, because Monday is maintenance Mondays. I try to structure the week so you could batch things per day. It's just way more effective. Like it's also, if you're a touring artist, you need to do press junkets. Same with actors, they batch them for chunks on days because they're greased and they're in that mode of talking to the press.
Yeah.
So with the studio, if I'm doing a sample pack, I've got to focus on that. It's so tedious to make these packs, but so rewarding that I need like a pure week where I'm not working on any originals. I just do the samples, and it's very tempting to create some samples and you get inspired by them and then start a song, but you've got to hold back and be like, all right. Nice. Let's get all these done. Let's make sure they're all cropped and trimmed and normalized. And man, if you don't batch it, you are just going to be a mile wide and an inch deep.
So you're making sample packs for yourself for future productions, or you're doing them also for delivery to people who need sample packs?
Yeah, for other companies that sell them on a subscription basis, or so we'll do sometimes hybrids where it's samples and synth presets together in one pack.
Okay, very cool, very cool. Do you feel like the time you spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen, I appreciate you listening to this podcast, and I know you're trying to make your best record ever. But when you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then you're ready for UltimateMixingMasterclass.com. All right. Well, last question about Ableton, and then we'll just kind of go into our closing questions. You talked about -6 pushing, redlining a plugin, or I don't know which one it was. But when I used to mess around with Ableton, one of the things I felt like I noticed early on was you could kind of take stuff and just jam it into the master until it was redlining, and it still sounded pretty good on the output. Is that a thing with Ableton?
Yeah, and I get mixes from some younger producers now where they're redlining everything. Everything's got OTT on it, and that's like the multi-band compressor in Ableton that's been used and abused, and it's great. But if I mess with that gain structure, and I just did it, I was trying to correct this mix so it wasn't peaking everywhere. It just takes all the vibe out of it. So it's not. I don't think it's a good way to mix because you definitely are painting yourself into a corner. And sometimes I'll be starting a track from scratch and it just sounds better. It's clipping, but it's got these great transients, but you still got to manage it. So I think there is a lot of headroom in the latest versions of Ableton, especially in 64-bit now. But you don't need to use all of it. You can pump it up later.
Okay, so it might be there, but that doesn't mean you got to use it.
Yeah, no, you don't have to use it. At the end, you still have to deal with zero. It's just you're just kicking the can down the road. And especially if with social media, you're using like an Instagram stories, all these other destinations for your music, it's gonna sound super distorted if you don't have any headroom left. So once it gets converted to an MP3 or once it gets compressed, that clipping will make a noticeable decrease in sound quality.
Okay, all right. Hey, I completely forgot to ask you about Serum.
Yeah.
The bass plugin. We'll have to come back for another interview sometime to find out if that's one you use, or maybe dig deeper into some of the tools you use. But maybe they'll show up here. We'll jump to our closing questions really quickly, and maybe anything regarding the tools you use you want to refer to. But when you started out in music or started out in EDM, I know we didn't really get a chance to talk about that much at the beginning, but what was holding you back? What do you feel like was holding you back at the very beginning?
I think the first part was cost. The barrier to entry at the time when I was getting into music was you had to spend $2,000, $3,000 on hardware to get a good sampler. And environment is another big one.
No wonder you took it to all your gigs.
Yeah. No, you had to, it was almost like you had to be a drug dealer or something just to get into music production. So I didn't do that, thankfully.
Right.
But I just remember in high school, I was definitely influenced by hip hop, and it's all about having good drum machines, getting the right drum machines. And I had to save up a lot of money to get an MPC. That took a long time. But I think another challenge is environment that you're in. What are you in a small town? Are you in a big city? And I grew up in the country in Vermont. I was just on the edge of the city, so it was close enough to a college town. And I eventually was able to break through that by sending demo cassettes to radio stations and eventually DJing at those stations.
Yeah.
But you need to have a good support community of people like-minded producers. And it's much harder if you're a lone wolf trying to break into a market that doesn't really care about electronic music. So thankfully there was a little scene in Burlington, but...
You haven't done a Fish remix yet?
No Fish.
Or a Ben & Jerry's remix?
I keep talking to Ben & Jerry's about a flavor, and I'm not in the running yet, apparently. So I want to call it the drop.
Nice. That's great. All right, great. So what about some of the best advice you remember receiving?
The best quote I heard recently was Rick Rubin said, "You don't get any extra credit by doing everything yourself."
Oh, that's great. And we talked about that on this, about, go to Splice, go buy somebody's bass drop.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't have to do everything. I think that there's this part of your ego that says everyone will recognize my genius if I'm a control freak and I do it all myself. But the reality is what you're seeing, the artist is the figurehead, the artist is the brand. There's big teams behind everybody. Nobody's doing it themselves. Calvin Harris does a lot himself, but he has a huge team of people that help him. And these are figureheads, and it's really a division of labor. So, you only have so many hours in the day and so much mental energy, and that's it. And you got to start anew the next day.
Would you believe it's not even just me doing this podcast?
No way.
So good advice. How about a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce? Anything else you want to drop on us before we go?
I think I really like the idea of the rule of 3. That's also a quick tip.
Yeah.
That Jack Joseph Puig inspired this one. He said that your brain can only really hear 3 simultaneous phrases at once. So it's kind of a heuristic. It's not an
Nice.
exact thing. Some songs, it can be 2 elements, but your brain, just like we're talking about division of energy, your brain only has bandwidth to process so many things. And it's already at its limits, just focusing on one task and doing that well. So I think you got to cater to those limits that you have. And your brain is trying to do a lot of things at once. And if you throw a ton of information at it in a mix, it's just going to mask those other sounds. So let the important sounds in your song shine and have supporting elements, but just get things out of the way. You got to get out of your own way with the mix. And you can do that with just choosing the right parts or doing it with arrangement. So that's another tip I heard was arrangement is the mix down.
Yeah. And that goes hand in hand with the 3 touches tip from Steve Jobs, three folders deep. It's that idea of our brain kind of having a sense of where things are. No more complex than 3. That's great. Any favorite hardware tool we didn't mention or give a shout out to?
I mentioned the universal audio stuff, but I really like the Apollos, the X8Ps. I have 2 of those that I use. It's just great to be able to track without a ton of latency if I want to record.
And have you been tempted over to the to Luna, the new DAW from?
I need to try it. I had it installed, and it's just another new thing to learn. Right. But I'm sure it's great.
All right. Okay. Well, how about software tool? Anything else we needed to give a shout out to?
Covered a bunch. I mean, I think Ableton's my main thing, but I love FabFilter. I love GoodHertz. I just got into their stuff. They make some really interesting plugins. So like their compressor, the Wolf compressor, is really interesting. If you want that, it does that like Dr. Sample effect that a lot of hip hop guys use.
Yeah. Dr. Sample, that little box with like 4 sample pads on it or whatever, right? Or maybe it was more. Okay, cool. So how about any tips for the business side of doing this? So people want to, you did mention that, and we didn't really go into the topic about, doing this for a hobby versus doing this for work, but any tips or any resources you want to share?
I love Evernote for organizing my thoughts. I'm a big list person. So I use that. I also do a lot of the morning pages. Like I think people should definitely read The Artist's Way by Julie Cameron. Mm-hmm. That's less of that's a resource, I guess.
As part of the morning topic you were talking about.
Yeah, do your morning pages. That's really important stuff. I still do it. I really like Trello. Been using those as a way to organize all the quick tips right now and kind of color code and rank the categories. And it already is a natural card form. So that we're trying to figure out a way to make that like a knowledge base for all the 850 tips that there are.
Wow. So that takes us right to that question. Where should the rock stars go get these tips?
So right now there's a website, mpquicktips.com. That's where the deep dive, the blog posts are. And the tips are on Twitter. So it's just twitter.com/mpquicktips. And they'll be part of this Patreon campaign pretty soon.
I think you're also on your Instagram, right?
Yes, they're on Instagram as well. So you can see the cards on there. And I definitely want to expand the cards beyond the 20. So we'll see what happens with that.
Very cool. Okay, so let's go to our closing question. This is a hypothetical, and you're going to take the Wayback Machine and go back in time and find young Morgan, and you tap yourself on the shoulder and you say, dude, take your headphones off for a sec. I got to give you this this tip. Here's the single
Don't do it.
Yeah, here's the single most important thing you need to know to become a rock star of the recording studio or the DJ booth. What advice would you go back and give yourself if you could?
I think just start on the fundamentals earlier than you think. Songwriting, composition, things like that. Not necessarily dry theory, but start with that stuff and maybe fixate a little less on gear and sound design and engineering.
Now, do you feel like there's a parallel today? Because I mean, like now, YouTube shows me ads for chord packs and things like that. Do you feel like there's a real disconnect for new producers where they might completely miss the beauty of music theory because everything's prepackaged?
Yeah, I think it's easy to get these, paint by number kits for songs, and you're not going to build the skills that way. Like I think it's more curation at that point, and that is very valid on its own. Mm-hmm. But you want to be able to have those chops and spend the time practicing. I think we've lost the concept of practice as music producers, whereas it's easy to think about practice your guitar or your violin, but there's a lot to be said about owning your craft and just putting in and getting that volume of work done. So I think I'm pretty happy with the path I took in terms of giving myself past advice, but I think I definitely spent a lot of money on gear I didn't need and ended up selling. And I got distracted by the next shiny thing. So it's just a matter of focusing, build a volume of work. That's the only way you can get hits and get bigger records and get better is volume of material.
Yeah. And I think the shiny thing was a whole nother quick tip, which we'll have to come back to on the next podcast interview.
Yeah.
Very cool. So anywhere else you want the Rockstars to go to find you online? And, maybe should we be giving a shout out to your weekly radio show for them to check that out as well?
Yeah. They can check out my mix show In the Air, which is on Sirius XM on BPM. That's every Thursday night. So we've got that. We've got the podcast and my official site, morgan-page.com, and on all socials, Instagram, doing a lot of live streams right now.
Tell us about your podcast again.
Yeah, so the podcast, the In the Air is a podcast and also goes live on Sirius XM.
Great.
And now it's changing format a little bit. Now it's going to be more just a live mix, just one take, and just focusing basically on the best new music of the week.
All right, very cool. Well, Morgan, this has just been an absolute pleasure to hang out with you. And Rockstars, I hope you realize just how much we just peppered you with questions and you had an answer for everything, man. Well done, dude.
Great. Thank you. Hey, we had a whole course.
Yeah, we really did. Speaking of which, we'll have to figure out, when you're going to be teaching and how we can go participate in that. Yeah. But thank you so much for being on the podcast with us, dude. It's an absolute honor and a pleasure to be here with you. And I can't wait to hang in person when they let us out of our studios.
Yeah, let's do it. I can't wait to visit Nashville. I love it down there.
All right, man. Please do. We'll talk soon, dude.
Well, sounds good.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who help make this episode possible. OWC, Presonus, API Audio, Isotope, Soundporter Mastering, Jay-Z Microphones, and Spectra 1964. You will find links to all these wonderful sponsors in our show notes. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio, and they're going to help you make your best record ever. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.